So welcome everyone. It's an honor to be here. Happy to be in the last panel of our first day. To keep you all interested, after so many great talks, our panel brings a very provocative question to the table. Do anti-corruption efforts aid autocrats? Corruption studies have reasonably established that corruption threatens the legitimacy of the state and the possibilities of inclusive development. And thanks to numerous research, including the ones from Tina and Daniel, we have been able to identify several causes and drivers for corruption and refine the ways we measure it. The paths to control corruption are much more unsettled. Answers range from more enforcement actions, reforming the structures of the state, increasing transparency, adopting new standards, and demanding more democratic participation. Strategies may entail incremental efforts to big push actions, led by bureaucrats or law enforcers. Much more there is to be said and researched on the consequences of these efforts, as corruption is an inherently politically charged concept and speaks to the aspirations of justice and access of the population. When actions to control it fail, they deepen mistrust in institutions. Anti-corruption efforts, while mobilizing powerful tools such as criminal law and administrative law, risks weaponizing trials to shield friends of a regime and to repress opposition. In sum, results of anti-corruption efforts are still up for debate, and we are here to discuss them with our stellar participants. Tina Soreide is, since February 2022, the Director General of the Norwegian Competition Authority, on leave from her position as Professor of Law and Economics at the Norwegian School of Economics. She holds a PhD in economics and a postgraduate specialization in law, and her research focuses on corruption, governance, and markets, with a particular emphasis on law enforcement. Daniel Kaufman, who's joining us online today, is a senior fellow at Results for Development and President Emeritus at the National Resource Governance Institute, where he served as President and CEO. He's also affiliated with the Brookings Institutions and the Faculty of Economics of the University of the Philippines. Dr. Kaufman researched on economic development, governance, and corruption, among other topics. So I will pass on to Tina and then to Daniel to, yeah.
So thank you for the nice introduction, Raquel. I will not be speaking as the Director General of the Norwegian Competition Authority. This is in terms of my job as a professor of law and economics. So bilateral and multilateral development aid for the sake of promoting good governance in low-income countries has a long history of good intentions and bad results. It has proven very hard to induce incumbent leaders to stay committed to the legal and institutional reforms that somebody foreign have demanded from them. And too often we have seen promises of reforms in exchange for development aid and loans that have nurtured corruption instead of welfare. And among, well, what many of us think as more promising initiatives are the good governance standards. And by that, I refer to initiatives that entail some sort of standardized process towards committed reform, a system for transparency, for example, that can be evaluated by peer reviewers, or a convention against which signatory countries can be evaluated. Examples may include the UN Convention against corruption, or some peer review mechanisms in the judicial sector. It could be a budget controls or programs such as the Financial Action Task Force against money laundering. These are initiatives where countries can be evaluated from something international. However, such programs too are exposed to the risk that incumbent elected leaders pretend to be more development friendly than they are. For long, we associated the problem with countries in the global south without proper institutions. But today we see authoritarian leadership is gaining ground at the expense of democracy and human rights in ways and in areas close to us. And of course, I'm speaking from the perspective of a Norwegian. And of course, I will not start to speak about Donald Trump, but the distinction between donor countries and recipient countries when it comes to the degrees of authoritarian leadership is less clear than just a few years ago, as far as I see it. So it is against this backdrop that me and 3 colleagues, including Daniel Kaufmann, but also Eva Kolstad, who is at the Norwegian School of Economics and at CMI, and Catherine Green, who was formerly at the World Bank, and she worked at with the EITI initiative, which I will get to soon. We asked the questions a few years ago: what determines the impact of an international anti-corruption good governance standard? When will initiatives like the Financial Action Task Force, the Open Governance Partnership Initiative, or the EITI, which is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, when will these initiatives make a difference at the country level? Which are the factors and mechanisms that explain the success of an international anti-corruption good governance standards? Are these initiatives, are these drivers of good governance in countries governed by leaders with a mix of motivations? Or are they facades behind which elite members can grab more than they could otherwise, in a sense, so that the initiatives, in a sense, legitimize the regime and leadership and contribute to attract more support from development banks and donors? So in this program that we have two studies, one broader, where we study the mechanisms at play across 4 standards. And we have another one, a more specific, proper quantification of the effects. And here, because I will be short, I just want to say some words about this quantification of effects. Because in this study, we explore what happens to corruption levels in countries that join the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So the EITI, many of you probably know about it, but if you don't, you should know that this is an international governance initiative that was established in 2003. The first countries became members in 2007. In 2020, they had 55 member countries. And this standard, what it is doing is that it requires countries to disclose all material payments from petroleum and mining companies, the transfer from those companies to the government. And the government should also make public the revenues received. And if there are any discrepancies, this will be presented in an EITI report. In addition, the initiative requires the establishment of a multi-stakeholder group to oversee the implementation and facilitate debate. And in recent years, the program has also included ownership matters, contract details, and environmental impacts. So we tried to do a solid study where we have information about the year at which countries became EIT members, and we compare. We identify how democratic they are, and a number of many other factors. And we also compare with a whole set of 161 countries. What we find in this study is that less democratic countries have a different pattern than more democratic countries. And controlling for a range of factors, we find that corruption, the way we have estimated it in this study, increases in low-income autocratic countries following EITI membership. So if countries are already performing badly in terms of democratic mechanisms, they do worse in terms of the extent of corruption after they have become EITI members. The result is not driven by foreign direct investment or aid inflows, that this is something we have controlled for. But the result seems to reflect an increase in the extent of corruption in autocratic countries whose regimes rely on performance legitimation strategies. So read autocratic countries. So the result, we cannot say for sure, and we cannot say anything specific about causality. That is extremely difficult, but we find a clear and strong, well, significant correlation. And this is consistent with the idea that EITI membership might be used to signal regime competence and legitimacy, while in reality it may permit more extensive corruption among an elite. And we do not find latecomers in this initiative to do better. So if late countries that have become part of the initiative late, so we may think that the initiative has improved over years, which it probably have, but we cannot find that these countries are doing better in terms of not becoming more corrupt, if we can say it that way, when we speak about countries. So what are the consequences? I've just quickly, before we turn to Daniel Kaufman. What we see internationally is that authoritarian leaders, increasingly, they thwart information, the sort of information that we access when we study governance. They can, in greater extent than before, I think they try to manipulate good information about governance and how their own government performs. So we cannot necessarily rely on that information. At the same time, we, as an international research community, very often refer to such information. We rely on cross-country information, when in reality it is not necessarily reliable. And what are the positions on these matters among governments that offer aid? Well, those who offer aid is also, as I mentioned in the introduction, a varied bunch of countries. And of course, some of them, or many of them, may let commercial benefit affect their demand for good governance. Is there a risk that some donor governments condone the facade risk attached to good governance standards and act as if programs improve governance if they know that this is not necessarily the case? Or could it be that they see what they want to see and hope that the programs will make a difference despite their shortcomings? And we are not saying that the programs are not making a difference. We just say that in the countries that are already non-democratic, it doesn't really, well, we do not see a reduction of corruption. So how should foreign players design programs and evaluations for the sake of promoting good governance in a country where incumbent leaders only partly endorse the idea? That is the question. And I think I leave the mic to Dani to continue.
Thank you, Tina. Good afternoon to you all. It's an honor to be with you. And thank you also, Raquel. And to
we cannot hear you, Daniel.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I have unmuted.
Yeah, try again now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So let me start again. I was thanking you all. I was thanking Tina, Raquel, and the organizers. And let me just pick up on a couple of things of that Tina was suggesting, complementing that and related to our research, and then I will go in a further direction. And that is, yes, the research that Tina was discussing may have non-trivial implications and results for why would autocrats join such international initiatives for name or whitewashing and so on, not do the real work, but they get a reputational benefit and so on. And the evidence, the initial evidence in our research, as she pointed out, does suggest that there is no significant improvement really, or to the contrary, regarding controlling corruption once a country joins the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. And we're looking into other initiatives as well. And I think it's important to point out that that's not the same result for democratic countries. So we find a difference. Democracies, there's some evidence that there's some improvement. There's also some evidence that even the autocratic countries improve a bit before joining the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So they play the incentive games, which is not uncommon before joining any big club, and it's known about research joining the European Union and so on. It should be pointed out, however, that increasingly in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, there are rules and additional standards that imply that very autocratic countries cannot join EITI. So there's a bit of self-selection. So when we compare autocratic versus non-autocratic or democratic countries, these are, we could label them as soft autocratic or non-democratic. But obviously the Russias and the North Koreas and so on are not even part of the initiative in the first place because they cannot they cannot join. One way of starting any type of further inquiry as to what are the incentives that may lead to such results in any research related to these type of initiatives or organizations is to ask ourselves who are the key actors that play there and what are the incentives driving that. We don't have the time to go through all that, but it's worth mentioning that in the case of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, there are 4 key actors. One is obviously the implementing countries that are implementing EITI, and those, they are the more democratic and the less democratic countries, as we discussed, and semi-autocracy as well. Those are the implementing countries. Then there is the civil society as a very important group, and I was a member of the board representing a civil society, one of those representing. Then there is, very importantly, the companies. Okay, that's a key stakeholder, and that plays a very important role that will refer to my latter part of the presentation. And last but not least are the donor countries, the countries that sponsor, donor, provide funding to that. Norway is the key donor and was basically part of of initiating this initiative together with the UK, but there's obviously a reason why the EITI headquarters has been based in Oslo for that purpose. Now, each one of these actors have obviously very different incentives, but I like to suggest, we don't have the time to go through every incentive, I like to suggest that there's a very important interplay of asymmetric power, of influence, and related power issues between these different stakeholders in the initiative. This, by the way, also the secretary of the initiative can be considered another stakeholder, but we'll leave that aside for now. The implementing countries, and particularly some of the very oil-rich countries, sometimes they can exert very significant power in that both the donor countries and especially the companies, and the oil companies in particular, are not going to necessarily disagree or challenge. And in fact, the companies themselves would have their vested interest in this as well, which leads to a very important issue that I'd like to spend some time, and I'll share with you some slides on this because of work that I've been doing on the matter, and that relates to the notion of state capture that I've been working on. And that happens at the interface between the private sector, particularly the companies, and the state in a country. And I would like to submit that it's very important to move beyond the very generic discussion that sometimes takes place about corruption in very general terms. And some of these elements may be at play in initiatives like in EITI, but obviously not only EITI. But my presentation is broader than that, and it's about a different strand of research that I've been involved with than what Tina just discussed, which is very relevant as well, and that's part of our joint research. So first, I'm going to refer quickly what we talk about when we talk about state capture, and then I'll try to show a little bit this initiative that I embarked on trying to measure state capture by creating a state capture index, how this is done, what are the basic concepts, but most importantly, because of the time constraint during these panels, I want to show a few initial results because I think they point to the importance of looking at this issue in much more depth, and then some implications and discussion. So without further ado, let me go back, and this is more than 2 decades ago, with my partner at the time in work, one of them, Joel Hellman, we embarked on the study of state capture. We came up with a term to essentially describe what was happening in economies in transition, particularly informed first by Russia, but then also Ukraine and other countries in the former Soviet Union. And 6 salient tenets I'd like to summarize to basically describe what are we talking about when we talk about state capture. In contrast with traditional notions of an administrative corruption, which refer to the implementation of the rules of the game, which are given, they're set, and what kind of bribe is given for red tape and for a traffic stop and so on. We define state capture as shaping the rules of the game. It's basically the either illicit or undue influence behavior that takes place when shaping the rules of the game and of the institutions by the economic and politically influential actors. The powerful individuals, including corporates, become shapers of the state laws, of the policies, and the regulations of the state. So they're not just takers of what exists, as if that comes from heaven or from just a decree by fiat. The focus then, as a result, shifts away from the corrupt public servant to the economic and politically influential captor, which often can be a very powerful private actor, but often can be also be influencing and colluding with a high-level politician. Now, and we did another piece of research showing that the state capture would take place where there is marked inequality of political influence. So basically, asymmetric power by these different actors. The state capture can be legal. It's not always strictly legal. It can be extra legal. It can be legal. It can be without bribery, but the undue influence can be excessive and unethical. But basically, the captors themselves have changed the rule of the game and the laws to make it legal. It happened not so many years ago in the United States by the Supreme Court, or by changing the definition of corruption. So we had a paper also later on with another co-author called Legal Corruption, which may sound to the lawyers as a contradiction in terms, but I'll submit that that's not. So as a result, just to summarize, and for the sake of discussion and provocation, I suggested a brief definition to complement, if not to substitute, the traditional definition of corruption, which is the abuse of public office for private gain. I said, what about a brief definition called the privatization of power, or the privatization of private policy and of the polity? That's still relevant nowadays, very, very much. But at the time, we measure that by a survey of firms for the economies of transition. This just shows very quickly the extent to which there was enormous state capture by the oligarchs in Russia, countries like Russia and Azerbaijan, very much in contrast with the Baltics, and at the time, Hungary also. Look how different Hungary is today. And that had an enormous cost on private sector development. Countries that were subject to state capture, basically, those same private firms reported that they were growing at half the rate of countries that did not suffer such state capture. So now, what about the state capture index? Why do something like that? There's a lack of cross-country measure and nothing multi-year for this very important phenomena. We did it back then, but also only for one region and based only on survey of firms. But it's a phenomenon that can be immensely costly to society. Famously, Lord Kelvin, who invented the measurement of temperature, also said if something cannot be measured, it cannot be controlled. And very importantly, I'd like to submit, and we'll see that quickly in the data, state capture is not the same, and I just discussed that, than the general notion of corruption. It's not the same that just having absence of rule of law. In some sense, it's more integrative, more encompassing, and we'll see that. And another reason to have data, measure, and an index is that for researchers, it's a goldmine to have variance over time and space and see and look at the data, which ones have done better, others are not, how do they do over time. What I mentioned before in terms of the basic tenets, they remain robust of how to look at state capture, but with one important evolution in the meantime, and Tina referred to the growing authoritarianism in many countries. So one evolution is to also include very significantly the possibility not only of the typical oligarchs engaging in capture, but what we would call the klepto captors. And those are let's say it by its word, the Vladimir Putins of this world, where at the same time they become oligarchs within the government. So it's autocrats, kleptocrats, but also kleptocaptors in terms of capturing the institution of the state that basically belong to the state, to the people, and not to the leader at the top, in significant part to benefit themselves. There are some statistical considerations that I will mostly skip, but I do want to mention that we're talking about non-trivial statistical issues where the true extent of state capture, like in any phenomenon, governance and corruption, is not truly unobservable in a statistical sense. And as a result, we are in a world of proxy indicators. So we need to accept that we have to rely on proxies, just like any measure of corruption is the same. And therefore, this interpretive caution is very important. Small differences are not meaningful in a statistical sense. I'll mention some statistical results, but before that, the key three dimensions that inform this initial state capture index, it's one is basically the capture of the law, okay? The capture and corrupt rule of law. The other is the capture of the polity and of the policy. I mean, it could be, they're not exactly the same, but they're related. That's a second, those are the two key components that are object of capture. But to affect this capture, one needs also an enabling environment, or what we call a capture enabling ecosystem. So to the extent, it is basically this very poor rule of law, voice and democratic accountability, there is an ecosystem basically enables more capture. So those are the three key pillars that in essence we use. I collected data basically from three different sources that have relevant questions. We don't have the time to go through each one, but for each component, we're informed a lot by VDEM, that great political science source, the VDEM source, and then also the worldwide governance indicators, which with another co-author we started 25 years ago. And we use for that if there is a lack of voice and accountability, rule of law, regulatory quality, and external corruption for just the enabling environment part. But we also use what's happening with the top 0.1% and the top 1%. What kind of capture is happening in the income economic sense. We constructed through a particular methodology by converting to percentile ranks. We treat the missing values, and we have four period average, and that's from 1997 we have data until 2020. We managed to have sufficient data for 176 countries, so it's for the world. And the index, as I mentioned, is basically the simple average of these three components I showed in the diagram. So without further ado, just very quickly, a little bit about the results, because I think they can be potentially intriguing. This shows a graph I've been showing for 20 years, but it's for corruption. It's not for state capture. And it's not the 200 countries in the worldwide governance indicators, but it's only about 70 because no more fit in one graph. So here we see the whole range, and it's very significant variance and so on, from the Denmark, Finland, and also Norway there, all the way to the Equatorial Guinea, Syria, Venezuela, and so on. Then let me have the same countries. And what does this initial state capture index show? Okay, shows a very similar graph. You may wonder, why are you doing this? Well, the point is that the countries are not, the countries are the same, but they're not in the same position. They're not in the same rank at all. So the graph looks similar, but let's look a bit more in depth. Let's pick a few countries, including Norway on the far left. This is corruption, the worldwide governance indicator. Corruption, obviously, control of corruption is very, very good in Norway. So it's very low corruption, all the way to a country like Greece. Then I order exactly the same for state capture in the same ordering of country. How does it look? Well, it looks very different. I mean, quite different. So of course, Norway is still low, not as low, but still very low. Interesting. Netherlands becomes even lower, so not subject to significant state capture. The UK starts going up. And then very, very markedly, the US, which is a black, huge difference between just regularly measured corruption and state capture, which already implicitly Tina was alluding in terms of what has happened in the US. My own country, Chile, is also another case in point, relatively low regular corruption, but it's much more capture. Conversely, Spain goes in the other direction, and so does Greece. That's another way of putting exactly the same data and the same set of countries. We see that in some cases, state capture is higher than the conventional corruption, extent of corruption, and others is the other way around. It's the same in country. And overall, and in fact was hinted before, high-income countries, relatively speaking, exhibit higher extent of state capture using the same type of units in percentile ranks than for corruption, for traditional corruption, and for low medium income countries a little bit. So in some sense, by just looking at traditional corruption, we are exaggerating or overdoing what's happening in the lower and medium income countries, and high income countries, we are not reflecting the whole reality. This is just a plot graph of the 176 country around the 45-degree line between the two measures, traditional extent of corruption and state capture. And we see that there are quite a few countries with enormous deviation from the 45-degree line, whether above or below, meaning in some cases state capture is much more, relatively speaking, than extended corruption, or vice versa. Just to finish, so to have some discussion, a little bit about the over time, the trend issue, because that's also very interesting and important. It's not just a question of comparing state capture with corruption or comparing one country to the next, but how countries have done over time. Look, the United States, how it has evolved and has been increasing over time from the late 90s until now, a steady increase, particularly during the Trump era, it's clear. In Chile, there's always been relatively high state capture, even though corruption in general is not that high, but in recent times, a little bit better. Norway, we see it's lower. And a very interesting case is in fact, Uruguay, where state capture, in fact, was higher than in the United States in the late 90s, and then steady improvements while the US became worse and worse. So you see diverging paths. This is within the Americas, but one in the north, one in the south, going exactly in different directions. Not the type of thing that we usually hear or see about traditional measures of corruption. And lastly, the same type of issue that, the same type of picture, but about another part of the world. So we see the Russias, the Turkeys, and the Hungaries with a steady increase, in particular because of the rise of the kleptocaptors and their collusion with the oligarchs. So at first there are oligarchs only in Russia, but then enormous collusion with the kleptocaptors and so on. Similarly in Turkey and Hungary. In some contrast, Ukraine at first is higher even than Russia, than all of them. But in recent times and recent years, with more democracy and so on, it improves, as we see in this purple line. And so does a country like Georgia. So there's nothing predetermined about that. And countries can exhibit very different paths and patterns. Some implications, just to quickly conclude, and I apologize for the quickness by which I went through the slides. So it's to point out that there is a limit to the usefulness of generic notions and discussions of corruption. I think getting into the specifics is very important, and one particular manifestation that matters enormously and it's very costly is state capture. And that can be largely driven by private oligarchs or by state kleptocrats. But collusion between both is not uncommon, as we discussed. It appears from this initial, the work that I have done, that the state capture index is feasible with 25 years of coverage. But some caution, it is a proxy, there are margins of errors, so caution is called for. The initial results do suggest that there is a difference between state capture versus traditional notions of corruption or of rule of law, for that matter. There is high variance across the components that inform state capture. I didn't go through that because of time, but also high variance across countries and over time. And that's ripe for a lot of research and implications. High income countries, state capture index suggests that is higher than the traditionally measured extent of corruption for high-income countries, as we mentioned. And we suggest here that there's a feasible integration of oligarchic and kleptocratic capture, which leads to the point that in some sense, by talking about state capture, we're talking about the intersection of a particular form of high-level corruption and the polity, and particularly the issues of unequal influence, democracy versus autocracy, can be basically integrated into this framework and into this measurement, which is what I'm trying to do. Thank you very much for this, for your patience. Thank you, and let's hope we can have a good discussion.
So Thank you, Tina and Daniel, for very interesting talks. And while I invite people from the audience to make questions, I will maybe kick off with one question from my own. So I have a question on policy prescriptions, even though you're both really doing more, let's say, descriptive work here. I wonder for this very counterintuitive conclusion that the adoption of the EITI standards for some countries actually lead to an increased corruption. I wonder if the question is to double down on the bet of democratic clauses and the risks of them to alienating these countries from these initiatives, or should we think about specific mechanisms to empower different stakeholders when countries already perform so badly in terms of their democratic functioning? And for Daniel, there's a reason why there's a lot of resistance to broadening the concept of corruption. And as a legal scholar, it's because once we call it corruption, we kind of tend to think about measures to tame it that mobilize such strong legal apparatus and repression. And of course, this wouldn't work with state capture. So I wonder, so what are the measures or what are the consequences of calling it out, state capture, in terms of policies we should pursue, right? So
Okay.
is there any more questions from the audience? Maybe we could take, yeah. Okay. Just one very brief round. Yeah.
Thanks. That was two really interesting presentations. My question is, partly just that we didn't spend enough time thinking, on the indicators, and the slides were too small. So I couldn't fully understand the indicators that built up the proxy measure of state capture. And so it seemed to me as if the state capture index is particularly useful for thinking of capture by powerful private sector interests, but how useful it would be to think about capture by social classes, by social elites, and categories of citizens. Would the measures be useful to think about that? And I have another question which is not so directly related, but it's related to your last comment, actually. We think of corruption as a bad thing in a particular kind of box. Some elements of state, state capture exists in highly functional systems, which are, where it's not illegal and the system is functional enough for state capture to be kind of rule bound and, in sort of tidy frameworks. And so, what are the effects actually? In moving the concept to state capture, are we sometimes, like, I don't know, because I don't know enough about the indicators, thinking about things that in itself would not be a bad thing, but perhaps add up to something which is, it's the sum rather than the parts that are actually more problematic?
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. And thank you, Daniel, for complimenting my comments. And I hope you also noted that we find that good governance standards may actually deliver in countries that have a certain level of democracy. So I think it's very good that you pointed it out, Dani. I think the two different presentations, they imply that good governance indicators or standards will not reduce, we cannot expect it to reduce corruption if state capture is a problem. I think that is what it boils down to. And you asked what is the policy implication. Well, I think we should not be naive, and we should demand more oversight in countries where we cannot rely on the democratic structures. We should have stricter definitions. And one of the things I see in a different study that I'm doing is that when countries implement a convention in their country, they do it in many different ways, and a convention does not mean the same thing in one country as in the next. So I think these international initiatives need to be stricter in terms of seeing results on the ground. And also, of course, evaluation should be independent of the government system as far as possible. And that may apply to all countries, regardless of whether they are regardless of how democratic they are. And I just also want to answer, because the question about how useful this is, well, I think it helps us. It is important to try to add nuance to the different problems that we associate with some form of corruption. So I think it's very useful the way it's Daniel and others have tried to map the problems. But I think also that we need to think about the term corruption in terms of a legal category, because in terms of being useful, it should be define problems that we want to act on. So corruption is a legal category, and it's a moral category, and for the definition to be useful, we need to be able to act on it. So I think that is perhaps missing from the discussion and the question of usefulness. I think I leave it with that.
Daniel, if you want to do your final remarks.
Yeah, and your probing questions suggest that we may wish to stay until midnight, but I know that that's not allowed. So maybe that would be another session, and we cannot pretend to have the full answer. Those are very good questions and comments you had. First, on the reticence to broaden the notion of corruption, I would submit that part of the effort here is to make it more specific and to an extent in the conceptual sense, to narrow it, even though there are some elements which are legal that are coming into that. But since I'm not a lawyer, as I mentioned, and I have written a piece called Legal Corruption, I don't consider that weighing into some legal territory is expanding. As I mentioned before, what if there's true capture in a country? So the captors basically capture also the rule of law, and they can alter the laws at that time to suit them. So it can be perfectly the case, legal corruption, and there are many cases. For anybody who is skeptical about this issue in reality, and that focusing too much on that may detract, an emblematic case study, and you come from that part of the world, Raquel, is Odebrecht and Petrobras, which I think is one of the base cases, and is a fantastic, TV series called O Mecanismo that explain how it worked. And this was not the regular traditional corruption that we talk about. And going that route and understanding these mechanisms, how they work, I think it's crucial. It leads then to different focus in terms of policy implication. For once, in quasi-democratic or democratic countries, the whole issue of political finance becomes absolutely crucial in a way that sometimes traditional anti-corruption campaigns don't focus on. Another, and let's take the case of Odebrecht, there are some innovations in the legal arena. A fantastic innovation that Brazil had many years ago, and I'm sure you would comment much more on that, is essentially the equivalent of plea bargaining and the ability basically to convince Marcelo Odebrecht to spill all the beans and provide all the information about the whole system, the mechanism, and about all the partners in corruption in lieu of a more lenient sentence, something that exists in the United States, but many other countries in the world have not adopted that. So I'm talking about very specific type of also policy issues that could go much further, that sometimes we don't focus when we're just discussing the traditional red tape type of corruption. I could go on and on. There are other differences, and there are also some similarities. The whole strengthening of rule of law, which did happen in Brazil over a period of a decade, was very important also in exposing that, and certain transparency, not transparency in general, but particular transparency initiatives in certain areas which are particularly subject to capture are very, very important. So that's just to give a few examples that this matters enormously for policy. And the fact that we have been reticent, and I believe in part it's for political reasons, it's very sensitive issue in many countries, although there's one country that has totally adopted this framework, and they don't talk about corruption anymore. They talk about state capture only, and that's South Africa. And that's the whole commission and about Zuma and what happened is about state capture commission. But there's certain reticence that I would lastly suggest to look at the cost of different manifestation of corruption. And I would not be surprised if state capture comes at the top for the very simple, intuitive reason, but there's also a bit of data on that we're talking about changing the whole rules of the game and capturing institutions rather than fiddling with one contract or the implementation here and there. So it's orders of magnitude different.
Daniel,
And to the other speaker, just to suggest, yes, the framework can allow for different type of captors, including social captors and so on. In fact, BDM has some data on that, which we do use. In some cases, coming also from the military, trade unions, and other actors. So it's to say, yes, I echo that, and that can be done.
Thank you so much, Tina and Daniel, and all the audience. This is, I guess, the end of day one. We have much more to come. Yeah, thank you. Again, if you join me on a round of applause.